In my younger years, I had a bit of a drug problem, and most of my friends did too. Once I started, it wasn't long before my parents kicked me out of the house. I don't blame them. If my kids were stealing everything that wasn't nailed down to sell for dope, I'd have done the same thing. I started out on the streets, but I was soon helped out by a couple of friends of mine who had a place in a trailer park. Larry and Shonda had been together for at least 10 years, and during that time, their relationship had been more volatile than a meth lab. In the brief time I stayed with them, I must have seen them beat the crap out of each other at least once a week. I could never figure out if the fights were caused by the drugs or if that was just the way their relationship was. Everyone who knew them chose not to get involved because the one time somebody did, they were attacked by both of them. Let them kill each other, I don't care, was the attitude of most, but no one truly meant it. Unfortunately, they almost did, many times, but the last fight proved to go farther than any had before, much farther. I had lived on their couch for about 2 months when it happened. We spent most of our days separate or together, trying to figure out ways to hustle up the money to score some meth or whatever our personal drug of choice was at the time. I had been working odd jobs with another friend of ours for the last 2 weeks, whether it was removing window air conditioning units from windows for old folks or painting people's mailboxes. On recycling days, I would steal a grocery cart and go around neighborhoods picking up bottles and cans to cash in for money. I did all right, and I only had to work for a few hours each morning to do it. Shonda and Larry usually worked together as a team. Their hustles were usually illegal, but on occasion, they'd lower themselves and beg on street corners or downtown. However, they would usually steal things from stores and then sell those same things to certain people who wanted them, kind of like ordering things from a friend and then selling those things to you for half price, sometimes less. It was definitely a lucrative deal, but the dangers of getting arrested were too high for me. Kicking is hell anytime, but in jail, it's the worst. I prefer my freedom, thank you. All three of us had an exceptionally good day, so we scored more than usual. I had just taken a handful of pills about an hour before, and I was sprawled out across the couch enjoying my high. Shonda and Larry had gone into their room at some point to smoke and have sex. I had been nodding in and out for God knows how long when I was slapped back into reality by a blood-curdling series of screams. Not the usual kind like when they fought, but the kind you hear in a horror movie. I was so whacked out, I wasn't sure what was going on. All I know is, I was scared out of my mind. The screams lasted for a good 20 seconds before everything went quiet. About a minute later, Shonda and Larry's bedroom door flew open so hard the knob banged into the wall. I could hear Shonda crying and mumbling to herself at the other end of the hall. Since I had zero idea what had happened, the only thing I could figure out to do was pretend I was asleep, so that's just what I did. I'd never gotten involved in a drama before, and this probably wasn't the right time to start. I picked up the blanket from the end of the couch, pulled it over me, and closed my eyes. The sounds of her footsteps came echoing down the hall. My only fear was that she would attack me in my sleep, but I kept playing possum as she got closer. Finally, her steps stopped, and I could hear her heavy breathing behind me. The wait was agonizing, but I didn't move. After what seemed like an eternity, her steps started again and continued until I heard the front door open and close. I exhaled so loudly, I was afraid for a moment that Shonda would hear me through the door and come back in, but she didn't. Her leaving, in no way, relieved my fear. I sat up and started thinking through what I believed had happened. I had originally thought those screams were coming from Shonda, but the more I analyzed it in my head, they may have come from Larry, so with a large amount of hesitation, I headed down the hall. I stopped almost immediately because what appeared to be bloody footprints were laid out before me. Despite the blood, I knew I had to see what was up. Continuing down the hall, trying to avoid the blood, I finally arrived at the open bedroom door. Slowly, raising my eyes until I reached the bed, where his blood-covered body laid completely still. As I got closer, I realized his nude upper body was riddled with stab wounds. Trying not to yell out, I put my hand over my mouth and let out a muffled whine. Regardless of how dirty my life had been, I'd never seen anything close to as awful as this. Larry was beyond help now. His eyes wide open and mouth stuck in a spasm of screams. He was definitely dead. I quickly turned around and walked back into the hall. I wasn't sure at first what to do, but I knew I couldn't let that crazy tweaker get away with this, so against my instincts, I called 911. Even before the police showed up, I knew what they would do. Once they had ransacked the trailer to their satisfaction, they finally decided to find out who killed Larry. They wasted a large amount of time trying to pin it on me, but once it became clear I hadn't any reason to do it, they started looking for Shonda 3 hours later. I know I shouldn't say I was shocked, but the cops found her relatively quickly. It helped she continued to walk the streets for hours in broad daylight holding the murder weapon while being coated in blood, but hey, even a broken clock is right twice a day. That warped spoke was so out of it, she asked for Larry for at least 6 hours after they brought her in. Since I didn't have any drugs on me, except for the ones in my system, of course, they let me go. Obviously, I had no place to go, so I made a decision I should have made years before. I took a cab to my parents' place. At first, they were far from happy to see me, but once I told them I was ready to get clean and what the final straw had been, we had a big hug and a cry. They found a place that could admit me that evening, and that's where I stayed for the next 90 days. The first few weeks were a living hell, and I thought about quitting more than once, but each time I remembered Larry's screams of agony, it made my agony weak in comparison. When I was released, 3 months later, I was welcomed back into my family, and I'm proud to say I've been a welcome part of it ever since. Now I'm not going to say there weren't a couple of trip-ups, but once I began counseling, I was finally able to deal with my guilt related to Larry's death, among other things. 12 years on, I'm a family man and drug counselor at a county jail I once spent some time in, and a year doesn't go by that I don't tell this story to each group I counsel. When it comes to Shonda, she took the plea deal offered to her and ended up with a 40-year sentence. From what I understand, if she keeps her nose clean and gets good time, she may be out in about 25. I hope she thinks about Larry every day of those 40 years, and it motivates her to stay clean. I don't necessarily hold a grudge against her. Larry was far from a saint and gave out as much as he got. For all I know, he did something to cause a woman that he was well aware was mentally unstable to kill him. She never really said why she did what she did, but the reason is ultimately unimportant. A man died and did so in a horrifying way. So, keep that in mind the next time you take that hit or snort that rail. Not everyone around you may treasure your life as much as you do, and just because you may call someone a friend, they may not be there for you when you need them most. When I was about 20, I moved out of home and into a share house with about 5 other flatmates. Generally, at any given time there were 6 people living in the 5-bedroom house. One of the rooms had 2 beds. During my 10-month stay there, I probably had about 25 different flatmates due to the high turnover. Some were travelers backpacking around Australia and would only stay a few weeks before moving on. I had a good friend in there around the same age as me, I'll call her Jenny, who moved in shortly after I did. We were always joking about the many colorful characters that we encountered during our stay. Jenny and I both had the largest rooms in the house that were near the front, and in between our rooms was a tiny space us flatmates used to call the broom closet. It was big enough for a bunk bed, and that was about all. Whoever stayed in there would store their stuff under the bunk. One day, shortly after the broom closet had become vacant again, a Brazilian guy named Marcel, who I think was about 38 years old, rocked up and moved in. He seemed fun enough at first. He was always stoned and in a good mood, and always sharing cones with everyone. He always had his big bong with him and would laugh and say, "Hee we smoky bong, eh?" Our house was always a bit of a party house, with drinking and smoking being pretty common here. Over the next several weeks, Marcel's attitude changed from this happy-go-lucky guy to increasingly paranoid and angry. I remember him breaking down crying one night, and he kept saying, "The children are dying. The children are dying." And I didn't know how to help him. Another time he lashed out at us all and said the house was full of unashamed homosexuals. Myself and one other guy living in the house at this time were gay, and women having free sex. Jenny sometimes used to bring her dates home and take them to her room. I remember coming home one time, and he was in his room with the door open, but I didn't want to look in, so I hurried to my room, but on the way, I heard him making these strange grunting noises. It sounded almost animalistic. Eventually, his erratic behavior and mood swings got to a point where the rest of us flatmates spoke to the landlords, and they came and asked him to leave. He packed up his stuff, and as he was leaving, he pointed to us and said God would judge us all one day. After he'd gone, Jenny and I went to check out the broom closet as we'd never seen it while it was empty. I noticed next to the bunk, near where a person would lay their head to sleep, there was a small hole in the wall. It was just big enough that when you put your eye near it, you could see Jenny's entire room, and it overlooked her bed. Next to the hole was a faint, but grubby-looking man's handprint. There were also stains further down the wall towards the other end of the bed. Jenny was horrified to realize Marcel had been watching her in her bedroom all this time and also appeared to have been masturbating. I was disgusted as well. It was truly disturbing. We were pretty sure he must have created the hole himself, as before he moved in, a young girl stayed in that room, and she had never mentioned it. We both moved out shortly after that, but during our time in that house, I'd say that was definitely the creepiest encounter we had while living there. When I was around 24, I moved out to an apartment near my college since the dorms were unavailable or not spacious enough. However, I quickly realized that renting would be very expensive, especially for a college student. Thankfully, I was able to meet another student who wanted a roommate. He happened to be a chef in the works and offered to cook every other night without charge. I would be his taste tester and rate his cooking. Our first month together was fantastic. He made exotic meals that could only be found at high-end restaurants. Almost every cooking night became something I looked forward to. However, one Saturday morning, I woke up with a stomach ache. I rushed to the bathroom and vomited. I was surprised and went to my roommate, who was making breakfast. He was also surprised and checked yesterday's leftovers, but didn't find anything bad. I thought it could have been because I ate too much after a heavy workout the previous night. In no particular pattern, I started experiencing belly pain every other night, both inside and on my stomach. I assumed it was due to my intense workouts and eating a lot afterwards. But I also noticed that after eating, I would get extremely tired and usually go to bed immediately, which never happened before moving in with my roommate. I also noticed that he always insisted on plating my food and wouldn't let me do it myself, claiming I would ruin his masterpiece. It made me a little suspicious, although I understood his perspective. I finally decided to open up to a close friend about my concerns. She offered to stay with me for the night because I suspected that my roommate was doing something to me, but I couldn't figure out what. I knew I should probably move out and find another place to live, but I still had a few months left on the lease, and I didn't have enough money to leave immediately. That night, everything seemed normal. I came home from the gym, had dinner with my roommate, and then my friend arrived unexpectedly. I pretended that I had forgotten to mention that my girlfriend was sleeping over. Surprisingly, my roommate took it well. Later that night, I fell asleep in my room while my friend stayed with me. From her perspective, she saw that I was fast asleep, which was unusual because I'm usually a light sleeper. Hours later, she woke up to the sound of the door opening. She stayed still and could see someone peeking into the room from her position. After about 5 minutes, the person, likely my roommate, left and didn't return for the rest of the night. When I woke up, I didn't feel any pain, and my friend shared everything she had witnessed. She was worried that my roommate was the cause of my pain. So, for a week, I stayed with her. During that time, I occasionally received texts from my roommate asking when I would return, and he would send pictures of his delicious food. As much as I wanted to stay with my friend, it was inconvenient because she lived far from the college and commuting was a hassle. She doesn't attend the same college. However, she suggested that I buy some secret spy cameras that looked like regular objects. So, I purchased 2 small wall clocks and 2 charger plugs. In my room, one clock faced the door, the other faced me from the side of the bed, one charger plug faced me from the table, and the other faced me from the top of the bed. I was concerned that having 2 clocks and 2 charger plugs in my room might raise suspicion, but I hoped my roommate wouldn't notice. Night came, and we followed the same routine. I went to bed, woke up around the same time with a stomachache, and then reviewed the footage on my laptop. I was shocked to see that my roommate had indeed entered my room with something in his hand. He acted as if I wasn't home, and I appeared to be completely asleep. He removed the blankets and started touching me with a toy, torturing me while whispering about his feelings and why he couldn't do this when I was awake. This continued for about half an hour before he switched to something else and left the room. I was in complete shock and went straight to the bathroom, showering and vomiting until my stomach felt empty. For the record, I'm not gay or bisexual, and I don't have anything against them. However, after witnessing the footage, I started to feel fear towards my roommate. I never ate another meal from him after that, and I tried to sleep at my friend's house as much as possible or have her stay with me. I even installed a lock on my door with a key, as the previous lock could be opened with a screwdriver. I never spoke to my roommate the same way again, and he noticed. He tried to sit down with me, pretending to be concerned, but I always made excuses that I was late for something. I talked to my friend about the situation, and she urged me to speak with the college. I didn't want to discuss it, but eventually, I did and even showed them the footage. I don't know what happened to my roommate afterward, but he was evicted from the apartment and probably expelled from the school. I'm not sure if he went to prison, but I hope he did. Sometimes, I hope he experiences the same things he did to me.